Between the time when chaos broke Cadia and the return of the sons of the Emperor, there was an age undreamed of. And unto this, KRONAN, destined to bear the jeweled crown of Aquilonia upon a troubled brow. It is I, his chronicler, who alone can tell thee of his saga. Let me tell you of the days of high adventure. KRONAN Da King. Story continued from KRONAN Da Kunnin playlist. KRONAN, the Cunning One, big boss of not only the Cunning War, but now undisputed master of all Orkdom on Aquilonia, sat on his golden chair, his thong. In his new luminous position, he had taken to riding around in it most of the time. Not that he could not walk or stride, leap or charge. Of course not. To even consider such a thing was tantamount to a crime against the gods themselves. For was he not the Cunning One, the most orky of all Orks on Aquilonia? Was he not even now called a prophet unto himself? For once there had been no prophet at all. Well, if you ignore the predations of the less scrupulous tooth exchangers of the Bad Moons. But I feel as if we are getting bogged down, for I was specifically referring to the prophet, meaning a warrior of the Great Ones, Gork and Mork, not the grubby money changers of the Aquilonian Stork Exchange. Why they had to try to institute the stork as some form of elevated and more genteel version of the much more solid and dependable chief was, quite frankly, almost unfathomable to all. Even KRONAN had been informed of this particular stripe of oddity, and considering it had nothing to do with the usual activities of the real odd boys, it perplexed KRONAN to such a degree that he sent out his bodyguard, KRONAN's Black Legion, to identify and then purloin the wretch behind it all. Of course, this meant a hearty round of thrashings was unleashed on near everyone in the war, until they indeed found the culprit. And when said undesirable was put to the question in front of KRONAN, it was easily discerned that this ne'er-do-well had just attempted to be cunning. He had, in his infinite infamy, even gone so far as admitting to copying the Cunning One himself, and had been thinking about it. For this orc had come from a location that had been abundant with the sad, long, doleful white birds, the storks, and he had captured many, but he had not known what to do with them. Then he cogitated on it, and had come up with his own plan. To trade multiple amounts of teeth for the birds, explaining it was a new system of finances, and that it was actually the idea of KRONAN. Of course, the moment that KRONAN had heard this, he had risen, and he had the look of the ages about him, his huge girth and prodigious stature, the largest any orc had ever been in all of Aquilonian legend even. KRONAN looked unto a deity of destructive power. Striding to his stork seller, this peddler of lies, he had taken a small hat from a stand near himself as he processed. And when he had approached the wistful and cunning Bad Moon, all he could see was the face of the traitor who had betrayed him so much before with these kind of antics. For all remembered how the entire war's economic model and its loot distribution matrices had been utterly thrown out of kilter, with the Bad Moon's very successful methods of creating false scarcity and squiffing all trades in their favour. Or at least, this is what he would tell his nobs if asked later. But the quintessence of it was far simpler, for this upstart scum had claimed to be thinking. He had to go. And thus it was that KRONAN took his spare hat and crowned this orc with it. Alas, he stated, it did not quite sit right. It was floppy. So with a mighty thwack with a thunder hammer he had lying around, he attached it snugly to the orc in question. Now the hat and the head were one, and would never be removed. Alas, in his exuberance to create a properly jaunty look, KRONAN had smashed the hat and head into an almost unrecognisable smush on the floor. But all agreed the hat would never come off the orc's head, and thus was their lord right yet again. Even in sartorial excellence, none could match their lord. Thus it was that KRONAN put an end to the clearly unfair and corrupt stork exchange. At least that was one tedious issue out of the way. But where were we? Of course, profits. As I was attempting to relate before, there had been no profits at all, and now there would appear to be two. The first, the prophet of Gork, the god of brutal cunning, was, of course, the mighty Gazgul Mag Uruk Thraka. His name was on the lips of near all of Orkidom, across the entire galaxy, and in his wake, wars were fought the likes had never been seen. Yet now, in KRONAN, some muttered that he was a prophet as well. The prophet of Mork, the god of cunning brutality. Now KRONAN knew he did not have the same level of notoriety as his guiding light, Thraka, but in his own mind at least, KRONAN had gotten off to a very good start. He was decades, if not centuries, behind the legendary Gazgul, yet he was on his way. And with Mork on his side, there was nothing he could not do. Well, apart from getting his left arm to stop pulling at his butt cheeks, or sticking one of its fingers into his nose whenever he was not thinking about it. And he rarely thought about his arms, if truth be told. But if he was not careful, the force with which the hand was put into either his butt crack or his nose could be, well, a bit ouchy actually. KRONAN was also aware that he was a little more runty than his massive biceps and triceps, and all of the seps festooned on his normal arm, for it had once belonged to his erstwhile rival, Tooth Smasher. And so it was that KRONAN was often seen pumping weights with his one scrawnier arm while being walked around on his golden thong. Now all knew that it was decidedly un-orky to be humble, so to have himself elevated thus was completely in keeping with the expectations of his tribes and mobs, the warriors of his mighty Wa. Yet it did serve another purpose. Two, actually. The first was that any platform heavy enough to support his thong was quite large, tall and wide. Many platforms had been tested for suitability, but it had come down to not just the weight of the thong itself, but also the massive weight of the cunning one himself. And so it was that the only receptacle worthy of his standing, and robust enough to support he and his thong, had been quite fun. And thus, his support platform had been designated as the only Baneblade heavy battle tank they had found on the planet. A shame to use it thus, but nothing his mech boys could do made it run again. Not wanting to waste this majestic battle tank that could otherwise have been torn to pieces for muggins and gubbins, and probably ended as motorized butt scratchers or some other frippery, KRONAN had requisitioned it himself. Hence, he was carried around on the backs of thousands of grots. Getting it up was always an issue, as the grots required the use of a kind of forklift truck to get it over their heads, and many grots had been squished under it when they had not gotten the numbers right, nor used any form of poles or other thingies for them to diffuse the weight. To be honest, before Isaac Newton had worked on the conundrum, KRONAN had cause for concern over the number of grots in his camp. But Isaac had done the business all right, and now the process was far smoother. All right, many grots still turned into liquidized green sludge when he ordered a stop, and most of them let go, leaving those directly under the Baneblade to be instantly flattened. But KRONAN figured these were within sustainability margins. Not that anyone would have put it that way, but such is the nuance of language. Oft it is whiffy and a bit conceited to some, but ridiculously parochial to others. Heh, go figure. Nothing in life was perfect, thought Kronan, but it would certainly do. The second benefit, other than station of course, had been the fact that nobody could actually approach him if he was atop his thong, atop his baneblade, and that was worth every last grot expended. For as his power had grown, he had found that not even the rule of 3 had done him any good anymore. His people now reached from one horizon to another and beyond. And in that amount of orcs, there was always someone who had not the cunning or insight to be aware of the danger they put themselves in when they so much as looked at the orc boss, let alone attempted to mob him. There was also the issue of him being perceived as being blessed by Mork, and so some had wished to just touch him. And that was tedious beyond belief. So the Baneblade was of just the right imposing size and of the right height and width to keep pretty much all but a fanatical mob of mentalists from getting anywhere near him while in transit. Excellent. And of course, it looked spanking, it did. Glittering in the morning light, it was a thing to behold. A worthy conveyance for the lord of nearly all of Aquilonia. But that was the rub, the crux, the nagging buzzing that constantly vexed the Lord of Cunning. For he was not the true master of all he surveyed. Well, he was the vast majority of the time, as he had utterly dominated both land masses on Aquilonia. And yet, there was still that clugnut, that dangler, that irritating pustule still remaining, the last Hume outpost on Aquilonia. Now over the time, Kronan had become increasingly disappointed in the vigour of the Humes, for nothing like this had ever happened before, not in living memory, at the very least. And considering how atrocious orcs were about their history, even one or less generations later, anything more than a score of years before would be lost to the sands of time. And yet, Kronan had become most astute, and he knew things that others ignored. He knew that things had changed, because they had done so in such a short time as his meteoric rise to splendor. He remembered those times before, like how the Humes, but the Adipi Arstarters in specific, had always been too keen on a revenge-killing spree, as we have heard earlier in this chronicle. Their forays into Orkidom to exact recompense for any victory, no matter how small, had been swift and brutal, exactly as they should be. And Kronan always laughed how the ultimate warriors of the Humes were in fact far closer to his kind than their own. Yet it was perplexing to the utmost, for none had come. None had even thought of revenge, retribution, retaliation. He had slain Marines himself. He had slaughtered an entire Hume army on the open field. He had crushed and burnt and butchered the Humes wherever he found them. He had, in fact, done everything in his power, everything any orc could ask, to be honoured with a suitable response. Yet none came. And Kronan was, well, sort of desolate. It all felt like such a huge insult, really. And so it was that he had left the one major Hume settlement alone on purpose, had crisscrossed the continent with his war, passing it on no less than 3 occasions. Now this was as close as he could get, without walking over the hills that shadowed and protected the conurbation, and stood there mooning. What in Gorka Mork's name were they playing at? Why had he left this place alone, some might ask? Well, it was a starport, or something like that. His mechs had informed Kronan when they had first viewed the place. From these huge boring grey pads on the ground, the Humes had ships, like massive trucks, they explained, that took them out into the stairs. For this was but one world, one place to be dominated. And the remaining mech boys, as Kronan had considered they might be taking the piss, so had snapped a lot until he was certain of their sincerity, had gone on to tell him that all of the lights of the night sky were, in fact and reality, and certainly not a sad and annoying contrivance, were other planets. Well, they explained lots of things about burning gases, which made him chortle, lights in the skies around which the planets circled. It was all tedious to his bodyguards, and more than one preemptively assisted their master by silencing a few of the mechs with crumpings until KRONAN noticed and waved them away. Wiping Mech Boy off their gauntlets, the knobs acquiesced, of course, but they were mightily surprised that KRONAN listened to any of this cobblers. Sitting in his highest, biggest, widest, most thought-attracting hat, KRONAN was now gobsmacked. The limitless potential. KRONAN had known about wider Orkidom for some time. He knew that the great prophet of Gork, Gazgul, Mag Uruk Thraka, had come from elsewhere, but he had never really thought about where he had come from. And it now shattered his soul, broke his calm, removed from him all sense of time and space, security or accomplishment, for he knew that this world was only the beginning now, surely. And so KRONAN had previously left the starport alone, as he had expected, nay, certainly anticipated, more Humies to arrive in an attempt to stop him, as they had always done in the past, always. Perhaps they were just late, is what he told himself. But now, after the word came of the final surrender of the last hive in the northern continent to Grinner the Backstabber, who had been sent up there as it was bloody cold. I mean really nasty cold. Like you wake up in the morning and find there are squigs and grots trying to snuggle into your poo pouch just to escape the bitterness of it all. And Grinner did indeed grin too much. Perhaps the cold would wipe the smirk off his face. It was the meanest and most miserable of duties. Hence, KRONAN had sent Grinner. He had let him live, had allowed him to be a big boss in the war still. But KRONAN had not forgotten his base treachery. Hence, Pong duties and tasks were always meted out to him first. Alas, when they had spoken on the new thingy that the mech boys had dreamed up, allowing both to see each other as if standing in the same room, there was Grinner. It seemed that the cold had frozen that annoying grin in place. All that differed was a chattering of the teeth and the icicles on his schnoz. All of that aside, the plain fact was that they simply were not biting. The Humies were not arriving as they should, not as they had before. And it was high time that KRONAN let go of youthful dreams. He was a leader of a war, a prophet of the great god Mork. He had to be a realist now. He could not wait around. And thus, he had to take this last bastille of resistance and he did not quite know what at the time. All he knew for certain was he had to complete the job. He had to take all of Aquilonia. So, the next day, he would enact his first reconnaissance in force to get a better look at the Humie starport. And so it was that KRONAN strode from his tent the next morn, ready for the activities of the day. Though he was in the very centre of the city, just north of the starport, he ordered his tribal tent to be put up in the grandest hall. He didn't like the Humie beds and their intrusive sheets. He found it uncomfortable and, well, to be frank, but no less earnest, a bit un-orky, really. His guard jumped from their slump talk reclined positions as he arrived, and it was like listening to a particularly enthusiastic piston factory as their mega armor whirred into place. KRONAN had the doors opened immediately, as he stood, feet wide apart, shoulders back, hands on hips, in a powerful stance that proclaimed to all, from highest to lowest, from old Norras to fresh youths, "Come and get some, if you think you're hard enough." The palatial portals were drawn back, and KRONAN glared at the entryway. The thin and long corridor that led to his quarters that he could see down. It seemed to go on forever. And, as per the previous owner's rules, which KRONAN liked intensely, None could start to walk down this long corridor until the doors were opened on his end. Protocol. Now KRONAN had never liked it before, never understand the poxy way the Humies thought that they could not only lord it over other races, but even their own people. But KRONAN had spent his time in the trenches, pressing the flesh, meeting and greeting without eating. He had made his presence known in the war. They were his now. Yet, now he understood. It was not for the person living there. It was for the others. If KRONAN looked great, then they who followed him would feel pride also, not just in him, but in themselves, that they merely followed an Ork so successful, so cunning, and yet so quintessentially Orky. Hence he ordered the removal of the busts that had previously been on the plinths in the sconces every 3 paces down that long corridor, and had them replaced with his own image, to magnify his greatness, and, if someone was annoying, or even likely to annoy, he would bid them to perform the rite of kissing. Sidebar: the corridor of butts. Now the day that the Cunning One had taken this particular stronghold, he had seen it immediately. He had understood. And the ideas that attacked his now receptive noggin went into overdrive. When he summoned Mad Duck Krunkelstein, Hippocrates, who of course brought Happy Len, and Big Mech Izap Newtone, they were agog at his suggestions. Well, more a sharing of a dream, really. Their eyes had glazed as he had bespoken his mind, had passed on his vision. Now, some might say that the proposal elicited the kind of vacant stare one gives a person with authority when they have just verbally shut themselves in everyone's presence, and in such a way with such an intensity, so as referrals to specialist services are made the instant anyone can feasibly escape their presence. But of course, this would not be the case in this instance. They were all just mind-blasted by the sheer avant-garde brilliance of their war boss. He was a Renaissance Ork. The proof was this. Hence had come before, of course. His invention of origami, orkigami, the cunning-mobile, his cogitations. He was omni-talented, omni-inspired. He was indeed the chosen one. This was definitely it. Most certainly not the thing I said before. No, not that. This, the good one. Thus they prepared this dazzling feat of bio-organic and architectural perfection in the one day. Len was particularly helpful in this regard. Who would guess that Len the Grot would know so much about bottom bio-thingies? The corridor was completed and set up before the morning question. And there it was. Every 3rd pace of plinth, and on that plinth the image of their lord. A perfect cast, a likeness, like no other, but not a bust of his head and face, for all could see that daily. He wanted to be close to his people. To those who got this far, surely they should know their leader better. Hence they had to look at the many forms of his buttocks as they strode. Of course, the specialist he had employed on this work of art had made it biologically exact and, honor of honors, had filled each set with much captured methane from the Cunning One himself. They would be filled with his essence of cunning. Some gagged on the gases, not prepared for the power of the Cunning One, but all understood by the taut and relaxed orbs that they were going to meet an Ork who could quite literally clench their heads off. Sidebar over. Today, KRONAN only had Grinner perform the rite of kissing, and thus he was a bit later than the rest, as he stopped at every plinth to show his loyalty. And Grinner's hair squig was also a lot more windswept than usual when he arrived amongst the rest of them. Daka von Smashhoven, Madnut Krunkelstein, Gitsquisher McMurder, Izap Newton, Hippocrates, and even Runtherd Sidesplitter was invited. They stood and were talking through the potentials of a shufti around the Humie defences, when a massive orb of pure, unadulterated dental fury came careening down the corridor of butts. The greenskins present did not miss a beat, and actually sighed in relief as Kronan strode to the door, his arms thrown out, bellowing a deep belly laugh. For surely there had been deep concern of late, for Kronan's pet had not been seen in days, and if he had not returned, none might have survived the wrath of the Cunning One. And so it was that Tiddles came bounding towards his master. He leapt into his arms as Kronan was bowled backwards by the monstrous squig. It had knocked over every butt in the corridor, but Kronan was so elated to see his pet that none dare mention it. The two rolled around on the floor in a horrific display of sheer power. The squig was huge and seemed even more bitey than before, which was really saying something. And the fray looked so fast, the snaps coming from it could easily take off a torso, plus all the limbs and feet and head and stuff of anyone it actually hit. Yet Kronan was laughing all the while as he dodged it and punched it on the snout a few times. The thing backed off and sat, smiling at its master, now that the pet was sure it was indeed Kronan. For it was true, Kronan was even larger than when Tiddles had left. And Tiddles then opened his mouth to his master and let out his long tongue. He had brought a gift, and what a gift it was. Kronan looked on in awe as he reached out and picked up the present. Tiddles' tongue then retracted as he wagged bodily in front of Kronan, who did indeed pet him well, but his eyes never left the gift, and nor did anyone else's in the room, for it was a thing so rare, so valuable. Not for itself, but for what it meant. And all looked on at Tiddles in wonder, for Kronan now held a leg, a large, humy leg, and it was covered in power armor. Tiddles had brought Kronan the leg of a space marine. All in the room now laughed maniacally, fully, without restraint. Joy. They had been bought a thing to elicit unfettered joy from all present, for this was proof. They would get to fight the Emperor's own angles of death, the Adipi Arstarters, the Space Marines. When all the others had gone, given their orders to prepare, Kronan went to his Humi tech, his data slate, what he called his menu. For he could not wait until the morn. He wanted to rush there right now to see them, identify them, confirm it, and then to charge the Marines full on. But he could not. He had to take this seriously, for these were not orcs. These were not slime like Tober or Tooth Smasher. These were not even the standard explanatory deference farces, or something like that. No. These were the best. In the first instance, Kronan had told himself not to get his hopes up, as it could be the smaller Marines with the pointy noses. Starter-level stuff, really, and he felt he deserved more. But the size of the leg itself was enough. He had thought it so small as not to be the proper Marines, but then someone else had held it, and he realized it was actually quite massive. Well, for Humies anyway. It was just that he and Tiddles, had become so robust and colossal in dimensions, it could be nothing but an Adipi Arstarter. And so, he skipped the anal minute tantrum and went straight to their entries on his data slate. But which ones were they? Which? He had to know. Was it the Crimson Trysts, who, according to reports, thought they were quite tasty against orcs? Nice one. He looked forward to testing their assertions. Oh, so very much. Was it the ultramarinades, which always made Kronan think of cooking? A disgusting habit the Humies performed, dousing their dinner hours before eating it. How on Aquilonia did they have time to plan this far ahead? Were their lives this boring? The Spaced Fools, or something like that. They looked doggy, But they had some amazing choppers, and had even been advised by Gazgul as being premium tier marines, worthy of the collecting indeed. The blank tipplers, who had an eternal custard, or something like that. He wondered if they'd ever had problems with the desert raiders. Despite the silliness, KRONAN wanted a crack at these ones. They all seemed to have choppers, a good sign that hiding and Daka were not the main event with them at the very least. And of course, the blood bangles. They looked more Eldar than Orky, if truth be told, but perhaps it was just the pics in this report. He hoped anyways. He didn't like the idea of Eldar Marines. It didn't seem right somehow. They already had the pointy-nosed ones. They didn't need more, thought he. The silly man-bears seemed appropriately named. They were larger again, and of course they wore the colour of War. Green. Oh, yes, they did. He would be proud to crush them. The iron cans. They would bring lots of metal boxes, but they did look like they were up for a scrap at the very least. The Haven Guard, who seemed to just sneak about in their own castles like cowardly commandos or something. Well, so it seemed anyway. The Dork Angers seemed right up there with the blank tipplers. Choppy, heavy, perfect. But they too wore the colour of War, to be treated with respect. A good fight it would be, KRONAN hoped. The list went on. The Tide Consuls, the Angers of Darnation, the Angers of Furry, the Angers Hermilion, the Arstail Bras, the Average Sons, the Harharathans, the Cholesterol Lions, the Dank Crackhounds, and the Sexecutioners. So many to read up on. KRONAN eventually skipped to his favourite bit, and then got on with the day. He had a lot to put in place, and he trusted his bosses as far as he could punt a giant squigoth in mega armour. Well, he trusted them to be loyal. He trusted them to do as he told them to do. But it was their ability to understand their instructions he now constantly queried. But, to his surprise, the day went as well as any day can. Well, when it doesn't involve a huge kicking being dished out at the very least. Even so, all now seemed in place, and he was ready. Tomorrow would be fun, but he knew deep down it would not be the best of days. Not yet. That would be the day of the big scrap. And so it was that the day arrived, and KRONAN looked on as the reconnaissance in force took place. And he was ready. From his vantage point over the entire vista, he could see all, could hear all, could witness the ways of War that were used that day. He looked down on the fortifications around this starport. He had seen them before, of course, but paid little heed back then, for the reasons explained already. But I shall repeat these, as I do tend to waffle on inanely, so I would not be surprised if you had not caught it in the midst of my verbal tryst with your ears. In basic, he had left the starport alone, as he had expected the Humies to bring more troops. Better troops, more worthy of a scrap. There, done. Now to push on. Thus KRONAN now sat cross-legged in the highest peak, his own guard about 100 meters below him, as they could not make it up as high, due to their mega armor making the hand and foothold somewhat less dependable than usual. Of course, KRONAN was nubile and did not wear his armor. What would be the point of guards if he had to perpetually festoon himself with his best armor? No point at all. And anyway, even without his armor, they all knew he could take out anyone in mega armor, as he had most definitely and finally proven in his duel with Tooth Smasher. And so it began. The valley mouth filled with a carpet of tiny green beings that screeched as they moved forward, covering the entire plain before the Humie city, and it was running at full pelt towards said defences. Grots. A veritable sea of them. The hard points of the curtain wall were elevated nicely, and their Daka was absolutely prolific. Waves of it crashed into the onward-rushing, diminutive greenskin horde, blowing entire columns or ranks of them to pieces as they charged. Sidebar: Grot Motivation 101. Now one might think that the normally cowardly and rather ineffective Grots would, by simple dint of their numbers, have tried to rebel again in the face of certain death. For in all of the history of Aquilonia, only KRONAN had taken a Hume city. The mass charge had always failed previously. Always. Something that the runt-herds and youths had taunted the Grots with over the day preceding. And yet, KRONAN was a leader unlike any the Orks had ever known, for he truly understood them, the Grots. He had spent so much time with the herds, had an intimate knowledge of the little wretches both inside and out. Well, mostly their innards, if we can be candid. For in his early days of Origratmi, many a Grot had split or exploded on him. Yet he had persevered and pushed through these minor hurdles. But more than this, he had witnessed the discussions of the runt herds all those moons ago, and his cunning mind had absorbed so much, like osmostiggy, that he was able to recall almost all at the drop of a hat, which was quite prophetic really, as most Orks now took off and threw away their headgear whenever KRONAN hove into view. None truly understood why, but KRONAN did indeed detest others wearing headgear of any sort. Least of all, hats from the Humes, but I digress. Hence KRONAN was able to fathom what motivated the Grots, more than any leader had ever done in all of the history of Orkidom on Aquilonia. And it was difficult to compromise for an Ork of his caliber, for it hinged on a trait, an emotion, that he had so little experience with. Fear. It ran through the Grots like a particularly nasty drink that always comes out of your bottom too quickly. The Grots were just about cunning enough to know when they were onto a loser. Barely anything else, but this they could get, so to put it. So KRONAN would have to motivate them. And so it was that KRONAN had indeed invited Sidesplitter, the head runt herd, to his previous meeting, and it was with a tear of gratitude, of sheer joy, that the herd took his message unto his brethren. Sidesplitter had gathered all of the runt herds together to inform them all in one go, behind closed doors, so it did not get out too early, because everyone hated it when a really lovely event was ruined by spoilers. And when they all heard of the planned event, there too were tears of joy, unabashed outpourings of overwhelming gratitude to the Cunning One. It had been such a long time. None believed it would occur again, to have it not only permissible, but a phenomenal display, a veritable battle of ability, lauded throughout the entire camp, the entire war. This was a thing of wonder. The morn had broken hours ago, but that is when the event had begun. For KRONAN had decreed that all of the Grots in the camp be rounded up and placed in an area to witness the contest. For KRONAN the Cunning had declared that a full-on competition of colossal scale was to occur. A contest of Origratmi. And so it was that the runt herds had 100 tables arranged and walked the lines to make sure no unfair practices or gubbins were being employed, like choppers or glue stuffs, for the art of Origratmi, in its purest form, had to be the use of the Grot naked and natural. Thus the biggest enthusiasts were gathered and encouraged to perform their trade. Even some amateurs were given a table to attempt to reach the heady heights of contest winner, to show the beauty of their art. And so it was that the Grots looked on in utter bow-liquefying terror as they were subjected to this display. And as one, they understood the implicit message KRONAN was giving them with this carnival of barbarism. It was simple enough for even they, and it was thus. Anything the Humes do to them was as nothing compared to what was in store if they crossed the Cunning One. And thus they would charge the lines all right. here endeth the lesson, no matter how yucky. Sidebar over. The Dakker scythed into the grots, leaving chunks of them everywhere, slaying scores with one rattling discharge. And then it began. The sounds of the grots, the explosions, the screeching, the high point, so much like his old sanctum sanctorum, his axis mundi, KRONAN. KRONAN observed and began to think. Now KRONAN found the projection of his prescience into the perspective of the humans vile, but it could be useful. Most importantly, because the Arstarters weren't really humies. Not really. Their big boss, this Emperor, must have mixed them with the sons of War, the great greenskins. They thought and fought much more like the Orks. KRONAN knew this, and yet their hats. They were the key. Their cunning was so powerful in them that the boss marines, these catpains, had shields of pure thinking, and he now knew that this was a wellspring of cunning. And yet again, KRONAN knew all too well that this Emperor was only a babe in arms, was a puny god. Mork was mightier in cunning, and the grots did help. They helped him on his way. The curtain wall of prodigious height, the darker, the large areas of boring grey rockcrete that held some of the Humy battle wagons of the stairs. And he thought, so, if there were marines here, surely they had to come from somewhere. So they would have a wagon in the deep void above the planet. To take the city, he would need to crack the walls. To crack the walls, he would need to destroy the batteries. To kill the batteries would be near impossible, as their range was too great, far greater than his own big guns. And to take the space battle wagon would require another space wagon. So he would need to take the starport and nab one at the least to take him up there. But the battle wagon above would pour fire into them as they took the city. And that is when he saw it. This, all of this. It was the riddle of the boxes all over again, just with more boxes. He thought back to that first of all of his cogitations, his very first moment, event, practice of the dread art of thinking. And he sneered as he stood, the grots still exploding as he raised his mighty arms to the sky and gave thanks unto Mork. For he need not think again, not on this world. For KRONAN da Kunnin, the war boss of the cunning war, he would do exactly the same thing he did to beat the riddle of the boxes the first time, just on a far larger scale. Now KRONAN did not, of course, just use the one method of spotting, for he wished to gain a more holistic picture of the entire battlesphere. KRONAN would never have put it that way, of course, as he was not a fop, but the general point still stands. Thus it was that while the grots were being exterminated wholesale on the ground, there was the one craft plying the skies above the foe assault. For Dakker von Smashhoven was the only orc he could trust with this level of task. And so it was that the uncannily skilled and restrained orc had swept across the skies above the starport, and taken more than a few picks, as he had been instructed. And when Dakker returned, KRONAN had a very tidy amount of clear picks to view the defences. As KRONAN perused them, he knew, with the certainty of a Tau gun line being struck by an assault formation, that this battle would be an utter bloodbath. Well, if he played his cards right. He also knew the exact tribe and culture of the Space Marines in the midst of the defences, for they wore red and yellow in quarters. They had to be the growling Hiffons, and they were tough. The assault would indeed be a pageant of slaughter. And so it was that KRONAN began his preparations in earnest. Or was that frank? Who knows and dares to dream? But back to the tales of high adventure. KRONAN had given his instructions to Isaac Newtone, and his other big bosses. But some were less enthusiastic about the diktats, if truth be told. For much work needed to be done for Kronan's actual plan to take shape, and lead to his boot being planted into the rump of the Marines. So, knowing that the Marines inside would need a hearty distraction, or else they might sashay out to cause trouble, Kronan gave them something to worry about each and every day of his preparations, which weren't many to be fair. Of course, he knew that the Marines would be fortifying their positions further with every passing second, but needs must when the Squiggoth charges, as they say. Or at least they did these days, as Kronan attempted to make this little ditty intensely popular. How, one might ask? Well, by instituting the rule of 3 if anyone did not state it in every conversation at least once. Not that he got his guards to inform people before they even processed down the corridor of butts. Well, he did, but dissemination of such concepts is not particularly effective with knobs involved. So it really did take some doing, meaning a lot of crumpings in the days running up to the assault. But then, Kronan did indeed need to raise his fightiness, and his conveyance, his thong atop the now trackless Baneblade, had actually diminished his proximity to the annoying. Hence, his need to crump had similarly been diminished. And so, the new rules and crumpings helped out a lot actually, especially with his left arm, that was now almost as meaty as his own right arm. Moving on. The boys did not really understand why they were being asked to throw themselves at the walls every day, but being truly orky orcs, they did not mind in the slightest. In fact, on one day, it seemed that the assault might actually get past the walls, but this was gratifyingly rebuffed by the intervention of some of those wonderful Adipi R-starters, especially, too much slathering from Kronan, the intervention of a tiny amount of the Nob Marines, the Primanus. They had been hiding them from Kronan's war, it seemed. Now some might bemoan the loss of life, but not Kronan. For he knew that the mobs that survived, well, the few boys that had come through the fray, would be stiffened up quite nicely, and the frustration of not making it over the walls would make their rage and fury unto Gork's own when the day of the real attack began. And, in reality, he had boys to spare at the present. Kronan was staggered when he saw the lines of them still arriving every day, from tribes and climes he had never even heard of, all across Aquilonia. Still, they came. His mind swam at the possibilities, yet how to use them if the Humies were all gone? He sighed. Truly, when this last Bastille was ravished, as it should be, then what on Aquilonia would he do with all these mobs? A trouble for another time. He had sworn that he would not need to think again until after he was king, and so he stuck to his word. It would certainly keep. Kronan never once used his back-legion in these assaults. Not because he was saving them from the carnage, because that would have been astonishingly spiteful to orcs so loyal, but he needed every last one of them for his plan to work to its best, and Kronan did not want to take any risks this time. He needed to mark his pathway to glory, to make the Emperor of the Humies take stock, so he would then send progressively more potent and fighty warriors at Kronan. One cannot expect to make it all the way to the Gold Ones without working for it, after all. He would have to take the head of the Marine Catbane, their boss, or it all might be for nothing. Well, that was putting it strongly. For a good fight is its own reward. But he, unlike so many in Orkidom, was aiming much higher. His goals far outstripped that of any orc he had ever known, except perhaps the prophet of Gork, Gazgul. Hence was all finally in place, all perfectly aligned. The moment had come, and Kronan could scarce control his excitement. The riddle of the boxes was about to be concluded to his advantage yet again. True, there were more boxes to this conundrum, but in its essence, it was the same. So, if Mork was right the first time, and he surely was, then if it ain't broke, don't fix it. KRONAN leered his finest, most toothy leer as he rose on that blessed morn. And so it was that the Azure Falcon, strike cruiser of the Emperor's own Angles of Death, had a rather eventful morning. Now it wasn't immediately apparent that they were lax, for nothing could be further from the truth. There had been raids and cull missions on a regular basis. Storm Ravens and Storm Talons had been on near-perpetual sorties into the atmosphere, smashing the huge collections of greenskins that had not yet arrived at their constant muster, and squads had been used to hem them in and butcher them all. But the main body was left alone and seemed utterly oblivious to what was going on, because the Marines wanted them all in one place, under the targeting crosses of their incredibly well-worked-out defences planetside. And that is when the ship would unleash hell and make sure there was nowhere for the greenskins to go, for they were scum in the eyes of the Emperor. Few Marines were actually present on board, so nobody actually thought to bother them with banal oddities. And so it was that the flashing lights were at first ignored. They did not seem to be direct weapons of any sort. They were so harmless that not even the proximity or targeting sensors gave off any warning before they bloomed in the darkness of the void. Yet, as they seemed to be getting closer, the deck officer advised to summon the bridge officers to active duty. They had been in some form of long and waffly discourse, sitting like a clutch of hens, is what some might say, but more acute and astute minds would understand that the meeting had been thorough. The Marines did not wish to merely win a battle, for that, they all knew, would just mean that the Orks would scatter back to their old grounds. They would return to their turf and be dashed difficult to winkle out, as had always been the case on this world, on Aquilonia. A pity, as the Humies had thought that the planet had been rather a lovely little idyll with an incredibly long and rich history. Also, when the greenskins had been leaderless, they had been easily handled, culled to levels where they were a nuisance, but not a threat. Now, none could believe that in such a short few years the entire orb had been taken by an Ork clustering. When the bridge officers arrived, they took stock, and without a second wasted, they gave new directions, ordered the light bursts to be analysed. Auspex scanners whirred, and the regions were brought into far clearer picture. And this is when the most experienced mariners looked on agog. For in the midst of where the lights had burst, there seemed to be small things floating there. Another burst of light from the port and starboard, and one above. All seemed miles away from the ship still, yet much closer. So the new regions were enhanced again, and the mild amusement was now replaced with stark staring terror. For in the blast areas of these lights, there were indeed floating things. They were Orks, and they were getting closer. The captain of the vessel barked at all around to heave to and power up and raise the void shields. All of the ensigns snapped to and did as instructed, but it was not enough. Just as the ship was about to fire its engines, the bursts of light were no longer discernible. For a second, some thought they might have stopped, but the older hands worked even faster. They knew. And it was these who did not jump when the alarms went off. The rookies practically escaped their skin. All looked at the lights and winced at the klaxons. They were used to them, but not expecting them. Not here, not above this dirt globe, because they had been boarded en masse. On Aquilonia, KRONAN looked on impatiently as Isaac Newton was using a strange contraption that covered one eye with a huge type of horn or something, like a hollow spear. Odd. It had glass at one end and the other. Yet as he looked up, he would nudge his instruments a tiny bit here or there, getting his grots to nudge others. And finally, he turned and gave the signal. He waved at KRONAN. And with that, the endlessly herded grots of mobs were permitted to run away from the pads, as Kronan marched forward with a full battle mob of his guard, his elite, his Black Legion. Near half of them, in fact, and that was a lot these days. Onto the pads they stomped, and when the entire thing was full, off they went. Kronan leered at his boys, plus his main entourage, for he had brought Madnut Krunkelstein and Git Squisher McMurder with him. And so, Kronan laughed along with his boys as a teleporter pad fired up and activated. Now, being thrown through a teleporter pad is much akin to the use of a shock attack gun, for it punches a hole through the warp itself and sends things rushing through, just on a much larger scale. Thus Kronan was able to defeat the riddle indeed, exactly as he had done the first time. When he had told Izap of his plan, to ask if it was possible, the big mech had not even needed to think for a second before he was nodding like a maniac, grinning from ear to ear, which, as you can imagine, was quite a meaty and wide grin. And so it was that Kronan and his entourage appeared on the Azure Falcon, right on the bridge. Lucky for them, less lucky for the bridge crew. For Kronan nor any of his boys were in the mood to be patient or tactful. In fact, they were rather rushed about the entire affair. I mean, it's not often that an Ork gets to really get the drop on a human force, let alone invade a strike cruiser. But after interminable days of inactivity, watching all the other boys trying their hand at the city, even if they failed, they had at least had a day of fun and frolics in the trenches, amidst the shot and explosions. Ah, happy days to any greenskin worth his salt. Orky was the thud of cannon-hitting lines, either being magnificent, of course. For who didn't love a good scrap? Only weeping Eldar and wailing Humies actually required to win. They just didn't seem to get it. It was all about the taking part, really. So the Black Legion rampaged through the Humies as if they were an inexhaustible supply. It was after only 1 minute of mega-armoured stomping, chopping, slicing, hammer smashing, and claw crunching, and the Humies had all been used up. The Legion was still arriving all over the ship. Well, most of them were. There would always be a few sets left to float about and cool their heels if Izap missed the cruiser. But generally, he was accurate enough. Hence, within only 10 minutes, there were about 5,000 meganobs on board. Now Kronan was as enthusiastic as anyone else to get right into the thick of it. But alas, he would have to coordinate. The trials of being a boss. He sent his Legion under McMurder to take the most important segments where the Marines still existed, which wasn't many by then. A squad in the hangar bay were really putting up a sterling defence, though. Kronan was proud of them, of course. Another enclave of resistance in the engine room, but everywhere else was dwindling fast. The Legion were, of course, ordered to clear the lower decks. Many had flamers and a real need for heat about them, so they mooched off down into the dark regions where the scrawnier Humies were, the Charter Smurfs, or something like that. In any case, there would be no issue now. Kronan had brought with him some minor mechs, understudies of Izap, and they were already using odd beeping chain lines and muggins, pushing them into the metal stands of the Humies. The Orks were somehow trying to take over the ship itself. At one point, they heard it begin to say things, chirping in the annoying Humie language about destructing something called a self, whatever that was. But the next moment, Izap himself had arrived, emptied the contents of his stomach over another mech, then wiped his mouth, heard the repeated warning, and sprinted to the controls. Using the wires and other muggins the lesser mechs had attached, he launched 2 of them out of the way and began to push buttons as if he were playing whack-a-mole, and with a passion and energy one might only find in someone attempting to stop their feet being eaten by a mad pack of squigs. And he rested when the computer stopped talking, and then returned to his activity at a much slower rate. Now all of this happened so fast that it might appear that there was practically no resistance, and that would be a total error to say. for the growling Hiffons had put up a real fight in many a segment. The Blade Guard Elite Squad, led by Marconi Milan, had raced to the apothecary almost instantly. There the 3 veterans had held the line and slaughtered over 30 boys from the initial waves, and then engaged in a never-ending set of duels, as they held one doorway each, and the mega-armored knobs could come only one at a time. Yet, even after most areas had been clogged with greenskin dead, McMurdo had arrived and taken the tired Marines to pieces, allowing others to get inside to cut down the other 2 veteran arse-starters from behind. All told, the Marines had slain a further 30 Ork knobs. Brother Castanas, the librarian, was reported to have attempted to literally cut his way to the bridge. He had used warp powers of his order to blind or even burst Orks in front of him. His force sword carved through a veritable stack of Orks also. But when he met with Madnut Kunkelstein, he was just no match for the Orky weird boy. For the War energy was flowing through him, and the librarian was also fatigued. So the contest was short and final. McMurdo then proceeded to the hangar to finish off all last resistance. But all he saw was a single storm raven flying out of the hangar toward the atmosphere of Aquilonia. They had gone to warn their catpain. But before they had done all of this, the Marines had trapped and neutralized near every form of transport or weapon in the hangar. Many Orks exploded while prodding or playing with the muggins that they had left behind. And soon it was apparent that KRONAN's second stage of the plan might not happen at all, or so most thought. All they saw was no flying thingies, and no way for Dagger von Smashhoven to come up and get them, nor any way to teleport down, for there was no teleporter here, and Izap had come up to the Wagon of the Stars, so he could not assist from the ground and use the teleporters he had. Most believed it would take Newtone at least a day to recreate a plan to get them down, probably much more. But they had not factored for the cunning one. Oh no, they had not. For when KRONAN had organized the forces that would remain on this stair wagon, he then went down to the hangar himself. For the mobs left behind were to be very busy indeed, and KRONAN wanted Izap on the bridge, making sure all went to plan. His divinely inspired plan could not fail. Well, it was highly likely to, actually. But KRONAN was like a mariner of legend, his firm and meaty, huge and heavy hand on the till of the entire war. And so it was that KRONAN got to the hangar with Madnut and knew exactly what to do. For it wasn't actually important for many of his knobs to get down to Aquilonia. Realistically, he alone needed to be there, to challenge and slay the leader of the arse-starters, the Catpain, for reasons noted previously. Thus did KRONAN espy the teardrop-shaped thingies in their hangars, and because of his data slate, he knew exactly what they were. They were poop pods. This ship could send them down to the surface at an incredible speed. Without a second thought, KRONAN had his closest knobs bring some out, and the mechs were kicked until they opened them. More wires, more mechs being burnt or shocked, so their blackened bodies gave off an incredibly burnt, mushroomy whiff across the entire ship. Yet they managed it, and a full half-dozen poop pods were prepared. It was twice KRONAN's favourite number, so it seemed Mork himself was smiling on their escapades this day. KRONAN was quite large, as we know, so only he, Gitskusha McMurdo, and Madnut could fit into the pod. The doors were then pushed into place again by meganobs, and they were winched into place. Without further ado, KRONAN was plummeting through the skies towards a stairport. Well, he hoped he was. The margin for error was quite extraordinary, is what any passing layman might think. But when one is divinely inspired, as not only KRONAN, but all of his Wa were, extending even to the weird boys like Izap, it made near all things possible. For their god, Mork, was indeed on their side. And so, the 6 tear-shaped poop pods were, pooped out of the cruiser towards the planet. They hurtled down, and Madnut made a toe of Mork, green spectral energies swirling around in the cabin as they collided downward. And through the toenail, as he had done before, Kronan watched avidly at the activity occurring below. His plan was working. The starship itself turned on its axis, and its waste batteries now opened up at the port. It shot down, as the Nobs had manually loaded and fired the huge Dakka cannons on board. Fire to the left of them, fire to the right of them. The ship was unleashing only a small fraction of its full complement, as many a heavy Dakka cannon exploded or fired madly wide. But those that came down were realistically aimed by ISAP. And so it was that Kronan could see the shots missing his poop barely, but taking out one of the group headed down. But the War was in full swing. Battle wagons and trucks littered the approach to the port, fire billowing from the walls, from whirlwinds and thunderfire cannons, as the Marines slaughtered entire waves of good Orks as they charged. Yet they were getting closer. The fire from the captured ship came down, and in one moment halved the batteries on the crenellations and caused mass confusion amongst the normal humies trying to put up a fight. The red and yellow Marines dove from explosions, still firing down at the oncoming green tide. They were so accurate, so powerful. Heads and limbs were being torn off Orks as they came in. Kronan wished to weep from the beauty of it all, is what some literature would have stated. This was not true, of course, but his eyes were like saucers as he took in all that was occurring. He and McMurdo both drooled as they witnessed the carnage below, but Kronan also had a special twinkle in his eye. A look of almost fatherly pride as he saw the combined power of a Squigoth charge come barreling into the walls, tearing them down, just as he had done all of those moons ago. Life was a great cycle of death and birth, bogey flicking leading to choppers, and shooters leading to crumpings, and then ultimately to being Big Boss. Kronan could see the circle of strife, and he knew his place in it, as a provocateur. And it felt wonderful. But what didn't feel wonderful was all the waiting. He could see the bouncy Marines, some with long guns, some with short ones, some with choppers. They bounced around the starport, now trying to take down as many Nobs and mobs as they could. The Marines had expected the walls to fall, it seemed, for they had many fallback positions and barricades in concentric circles within the port. They would unleash their pinpoint-accurate Dakka into his boys, then fall back. So few of them had actually been ganked by his War that Kronan laughed. This would take ages. Hurrah! Huzzah! Other leaders might have thought this a bit out of place, callous or even careless, yet McMurdo and Madnut also giggled or tittered along, so he felt proper Orky again. For nothing filled the heart of an Ork more than the sight of a good scrap. Well, apart from being in said scrap. And that was about to occur. The last thing that the three saw in the huge green spectral toenail was the real attack now coming in. For Dakka von Smashhoven came streaking out of the skies with his mighty winds of War, and they filled the airs like locusts. They swept down and were wreaking havoc on the Humie defenders. No small number of Marines were also caught out while retreating. And, of course, there would always be some of the winds of War who were just too excited firing that they forgot to pull up. And so it was that the poop pods had plenty of competition as targets in the sky, so they all hit down. Well, almost. Or so. This heralded the other half of the Black Legion arriving at the starport, and their ranks were unstoppable. When the last Squigoth had been brought down, the Legion simply charged at the defenders across a huge front. Now, to say that landing in a poop pod is usually rather ouchy is a bit of an understatement. And when they did indeed decelerate, Kronan was actually glad he had not brought Tiddles along, because he would have become pate. The only way that Madnut had escaped becoming a smear was his prodigious green energy bubble around him, and also the entire poop pod. Madnut had attempted to use his powers to defray as much of the impact as he could. But McMurdo and Kronan both had a rude awakening as the thrusters fired. Now, only months ago, both probably would have been shattered like the dreams of an Eldar dancer when they had been told that flouncy twirling had fallen out of favour. The force of it was so much. But Kronan had grown, had become far more dense and robust than before. And as he had grown, so had his boys. Of course, the better armour that both wore also might have helped a bit, just a tiny bit. But now they were down. The weird boy let go of his control, and the pod dropped to the floor, 2 foot. Now, Orky magic is quite powerful, but rather unstable. So the green hand holding the pod had crushed most of it, so the 3 inside were a lot closer and pallier than usual. When the hand let go, the ball then had all of its ramp explosives go off at once, filling the entire cabin with ricocheting shrapnel. But only 2 doors went down. Well, burst off is probably the better way of putting it, I guess. And the 3 then burst from it like a triad of wrath from a dried prune. Overhead, the winds of war were dogfighting with the few marine fighters. They fought well, but they had no hope of controlling the skies. All around them, Kronan could hear the din of battle, the sweet symphony of slaughter. He looked around and saw 2 more pods smashed into the ground nearby, but alas, nothing came out of them. A pity, but then that just meant more rampant arse-starters for him. And Kronan could hear the loudest concentrations of Darkar, so he, McMurdo, and Madnut all rushed into the fray. The Marines had fought like titans. The cunning one had to walk over entire carpets of greenskins as he headed onward. He had no doubt that had he not taken out the stair wagon, not smashed the walls from on high, none of his mobs would have gotten this far, no matter how plentiful they were. Kronan turned a corner, and near walked into a small group of explanatory deference farces. He and McMurdo roared as they butchered 200 of them. His chopper raising and falling, cutting swathes of them in half in a single swing. Silly humies. McMurdo was stomping the heck out of them and slipping off limbs with his claws. Madnut harboured his strength, as he knew these were no threat to the bosses. When they could not catch up to the last fleeing humies, they pelted it down another alleyway, attempting to get to the very heart of the scrap. And within moments, there it was. And there he was. The central stairs up to the massive building, which was now burning from anywhere over the 3rd floor. Dakar jets jutted from it, and bomb blasts had blackened it, so that only tiny slithers of the alabaster walls remained untarnished. At the foot of the stairs was a circle of death. Red and yellow-coloured Marines all stood behind makeshift defences and snapped shots out at the oncoming waves of Kronan's mobs. Yet standing dead centre, right at the top of the stairs, not hiding, not skulking, but feet far apart, shoulders back, the Catpain stood. Kronan recognised this stance, of course. He used it so often himself. The "come on if you think you're hard enough" stance. Luckily, Kronan did indeed think himself hard enough, as he bellowed and launched himself into the air. McMurdo matched, then outpaced the knobs rushing in, so he slammed into the Marines, right at the tip of a spear of huge power-armoured warriors. The Black Legion. Kronan landed but 20 paces from the boss of the Humies, and it was most definitely on. But this was not like his battle with Toofy. Oh no, utterly different. For the Marine Catpain did not mince about or engage in posing. Oh no, he came at Kronan instantly, and near took his head off with the first sally. The Marine powered forward faster than Kronan had expected, lunging with his sword to impale the cunning one. Kronan stepped sideways and brought his own chopper down, like lightning, but with a power totally unexpected for such a shorty. Even if he were a marine, the Catbane blocked the blow and let it slide down his power sword into the floor, then uppercut Kronan with a power fist. Kronan felt his jaw shatter and lights burst behind his eyes. He felt himself flying up and then plummeting down. As he blinked, all he could see was dancing, wagging squigs for a moment. Then he shook his head and cleared them. He rose, much to the surprise of the Catbane, by the look on his eyebrows, raising to meet the back of his neck. Kronan sniffed, hawked and spat. A cascade of teeth, larger than most boys' life savings, came out of his gob. But he then growled and attacked. The Catbane was quick, skillful, strong and experienced, but he was no proper orc. After 100 blows were exchanged in mere seconds, Kronan saw his chance. He dropped his choppers and grabbed the forearms of the Catbane. Kronan's hands were so meaty that they encased even the power gauntlet. The Catbane pushed crackling power down his arm, and Kronan could feel the flesh on his borrowed runtier arm sizzle. The pain was just about right, thought he, as he revelled in this last moment. For he did not let go, and with the other hand, he began to move the Catbane's arm backwards. The also crackling sword, the blade, slowly moving millimetre by millimetre toward the Marine's face. The Catbane was stoic and resolute. His eyes met Kronan's as he tried again and again to reposition, to slide his arm or wrists, or to release more power from his gauntlet. Yet the cunning one just smirked as he reacted and never let go, never tripped, never stopped leering, as he then forced the sword into the Catbane's head. The Humie was tough, real tough. He did not wince, he did not scream, he did not crumble or beg. He simply glared back at Kronan as his head was cut into and his flesh burnt away. Only when both of his arms lost all of their resistance did Kronan know he had finally gone, had finally died. Kronan then turned and hefted the Catbane above his head and screamed his most orky scream. The Marines that were left were in no position to turn to look, but they knew their lord, the Catbane, was dead, and thus, so too were they. And within only a minute more, McMurdo and the hundreds of Meganobs had made this a reality. No bouncy Marines were left, no flying Marines, nothing. Kronan had done it. He had done it. Kronan was now king of all of Aquilonia. Kronan sat atop his golden chair, his thong, amidst the largest audience hall in the starport, and atop his head was the jeweled crown of Aquilonia. Yet something was wrong. Something tasted like ashes. That nagging, buzzing idea raised its ugly rump and exhaled into his face. It had all been too easy. Where were the rest of them? The Marines never ran. Where was vengeance? Where was justice? And then he slowly rose, his eyes widening, his jaw dropping. But he had to be certain. He had to be. Kronan bound down the corridor at such a pelt that Tiddles Bear woke before he was at his destination. Kronan accosted the remaining exhausted mechs, raised hell until his needs were met. He had the other know-whats from the port and the space wagon sent to his data slate. And then he studied it for days. His doors remained closed, Tiddles deterring anyone entering. And he looked. And he looked again, until he confirmed it. He knew. He was certain now. He had been cheated. He staggered, his arms barely taking his weight as he fell forwards, sending the contents of the table across the floor. His heart echoed in his ears like a million drums, drums that got closer and louder as he panted. He could not see everything. It swam before him, its shades changing. It darkened, as he felt his veins pulse like they were filled with squig sharks. He could barely contain it. The hints had all been there, right in front of him. He had been a fool. He had crushed and slain the Emperor's angles of death. He had crushed the Emperor's weedy people in battle. He had razed every city of every one of their tribes and clans. He had gathered the green-skinned tribes and openly made war. Yet they had not come. And now he knew why. Because they were elsewhere. The other Arstarters, the blisters of battle, the breath crop of Craig, the Catifans, the Marinaders, the blank tipplers, the Bangles, perhaps even the Gold Ones. His dreams. He had been cheated. And KRONAN knew. They were at a bigger fight! The rage, the wrath denied, the drums in his ears, they hurt him now. Everything was green. His body shuddered. He felt every sep burn. His skin contracted. The desk beneath him shattered. Everything was green. The colour of rage. The colour of... And he threw back his head, opened his mouth, opened his mind, opened his very soul. And out it came. A scream that was amplified by every voice that heard it, and then emulated and augmented it. A ripple across reality. As it travelled across Aquilonia, and then out into the depths of the void. To be continued. Well, of course it is.